Wow! Father of the year over here. Any of you not have kids that don't want to go to bed at night? Kids who just won't stay in bed. And what if one of your kids came to you and said, I think I heard God talking to me? That would be a great thing to have a child say to us, wouldn't it? This is what we hear in this story here. All of us here want to hear God speak in some way. We want to hear that voice come to us. And probably for most of us, it'll be a bit like the prophet Elijah describes as that still, small voice of God that probably only we can hear. But it comes to us with just an unmistakable sense of familiarity because God knows us better than anyone knows us. And we've been talking in these weeks here on our Tune-Up series about what it takes to grow a living faith, an active faith, a faith that not only gives us something to get through the day, but as a church helps us to be alive to God. And we started out by talking about the first step for that is a faith that is thankful to God, that shares a sense of gratitude for what God is doing. And last week, Pastor Chris talked about a faith that trusts in God, where we are able to live as people who trust that God can provide all that we need, the care that we need, the guidance and the help to move us through the good times and the difficult times. And today we want to talk about how we tune up our listening to God. And, all of us with cars, you can tell when your car is not running right. You can hear that, can't you? Sometimes it's a terrible sound. Sometimes you just know that there's something wrong in the exhaust, or there's a knock or a rattle in the engine, or the worst sound. I think the worst sound of all, you go to put the key in the ignition, you turn it, and it's the sound of silence. Absolutely nothing happens. That's not a good sound when you hear that as well. The worst car I ever had. Did anybody here ever own a Chevy Citation? I've nominated that for the worst car ever built. It just another one.
I had one's great car.
He got the only good car they made in the Citation. Mine was the Lemon on steroids, and I kept taking it to the shop because it kept making terrible noises. And finally I said, I've got to sell this car. And a friend of mine said, Dave, I'm so glad you're going to sell it because when I see you driving it, she said, it looks like you're driving an old running shoe. I was crushed. So I sold the car, and I asked a friend who was a mechanic to look for a used car for me. And he came back a couple days later and he said, how would you like to buy a Porsche? And I'm like, well, duh. And he said, a friend of mine is selling one for $4,000. And I said, is that good? And he said, it's so good, you should feel guilty as a pastor for getting it for that price. And so I bought a Porsche that was 25 years old. And nobody ever accused me of driving around in an old running shoe again after that. Total strangers would come up to me at gas stations and want to talk about my car. That never happened with my Citation here. I'm sorry, it just wasn't the case. The only problem with having a Porsche is that the parts are all made out of gold when you have to replace them. Because that's what they charge you for like an oil filter or even the nuts and bolts that help hold the seats together and stuff. But if we want to tune up our ears in our faith so that we can hear what God is saying to us and speaking to us in those times when we so keenly need to hear that word. Samuel's call that Christopher read for us is a beautiful story. And in some ways, I always feel when I read that, it's like a once upon a time story. This young boy living in the temple, helping to minister to this old priest. And then God meets him, begins to speak, but he's not quite ready to hear the voice of God for himself. We know it was a tough time in ancient Israel. It was a time, we were told, when the word of the Lord was rare, and the temple leadership was corrupt, and so the nation was not doing well at this point. But young Samuel is working to help be attentive to what this old priest needs to learn from him. And the message in this tells us that God is always trying to reach us. God will take initiative to speak to us. Sometimes we think God is distant or too quiet, but God does take initiative to try and reach us. Do you remember the film Field of Dreams, where Kevin Costner is this young farmer, and he begins to hear this voice talking to him, but he can't quite understand what it's saying. But let's watch a bit of this movie and how this voice comes to him.